Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is Sherri Mitchell from Indian Island, Maine, and a member of the Penobscot Nation. Sherri, thanks for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. Why don't we start by you telling us a bit about yourself and also more about the Penobscot people.
Okay. Well, I'm from the Penobscot Nation, Penobscot. I was born and raised there. And then I went to law school at the University of Arizona and studied indigenous rights law. And when I came home, I remembered distinctly I had been driving for 5 days, and the last day was a 22-hour day. And as soon as I hit the bridge coming across the island and saw the Penobscot River, I burst into tears. And I've always felt a powerful connection to my homeland and didn't realize how much I had missed it until that moment. And so the Penobscot people have been living on the traditional lands of the Penobscot for thousands and thousands of years. And all of my ancestors, are in that land. And so when I think about Penobscot, what I think about is the fact that, I'm Penobscot, the land is Penobscot, the river's Penobscot, we're all interconnected. There's no division between us. And so we have a very strong tie to the lands that we inhabit and to the Penobscot River.
Fill us in on the general local climate these days toward tribes in Maine, and also mention what are the different tribes other than the Penobscots in Maine as well.
Right. The group of tribes in Maine is known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. So you have the Iroquois Confederacy up in the New York area, and then you have the Wabanaki Confederacy just to the east of that. The Wabanaki are the people of the Dawnland, and our tribes are in Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. There's the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Micmac or Mi'kmaq, and the Maliseet. And so in recent years, we've noticed a trend in the state of Maine that's been very disparaging to the tribes. There's been a lot of real overt frontal attacks on tribal rights and a lot of really confrontational statements being made by the administration, by the Attorney General, and by the governor himself. And this isn't something that's exclusive to Maine. This is something that I've seen in my work across the country, because I'm also the director of an organization called the Land Peace Foundation, and we do indigenous rights law in the United States and Canada on land, water, and sacred sites protection. And so the trends that are hitting Maine right now with these attacks on tribal rights are something that we're seeing across the U.S. and Canada.
What's behind that? What's driving that?
In my opinion,
Yeah.
my opinion, it's industry's desire to have access to tribal lands. Tribal people have specific rights that are unique in this country. So the United States government has a nation-to-nation relationship with the tribes. Tribes here have treaty rights, which is different than the rights that general landholders have. And so the United States government also has a trust responsibility to protect those lands for tribal peoples. And so those rights tend to bump up against the desire of industry to plow through those lands and do what they will with them. We're seeing industry entering into our national parks, coming into a lot of lands that had been preserved for future generations, and now those lands are being opened up to extractive practices. And so the Enbridge Line 9 that went from the west to east across Canada was approved, and shortly after that was approved, our governor and other officials from the state of Maine met with Canadian officials and ExxonMobil. And when they came back from that meeting, it was very shortly after that that the Attorney General issued a statement that the tribes did not have rights to the waterways that surrounded their communities, even though those rights had been recognized for the history of the relationship that the United States has and the state of Maine has with the tribes.
Now, is this just happening under this administration, or was this going
This
on
was
during
going on.
previous?
Yeah, this has been going on for a while. We saw a lot of attack on tribal rights under Baldacci as well. And he had always proclaimed to be a friend to the tribes until he was elected governor, and then he did a complete 180 and really became I hate to use the word enemy, but he really kind of turned on the tribes and really attacked them. And so this is something that's been building for a long period of time. When I was a young girl, we had a lot of experiences with really overt racism. When I went to high school in Old Town, none of the tribal students were allowed to enter into college prep courses. So my family had to send me somewhere else, and they had the means to do that. Not everybody had that opportunity. And so, there was this real systematic approach to suppressing Native people. And things started to get better for a little bit, but now it seems like we're rapidly going backwards, where there are open attacks against tribal people in the media, there are open attacks against tribal people in private settings. And the Passamaquoddy have been facing similar situations where their fishing rights, because they are on the ocean, and so their fishing rights, their traditional fishing rights, are being constantly challenged by the Attorney General and the state of Maine. And so, to me, this is kind of a exposing of the underbelly of racism that's been hiding under the surface for a long time here in the state of Maine. And when they see that behavior modeled publicly by the administration and by officials in the state of Maine, then it gives people the courage to bring that racism out into the light. And so there's been a real backlash against tribal people on some fronts, where there's been real overt racism that's been being expressed that I haven't seen expressed since I was a young girl.
There's a long history of this in the United States.
Yes.
This kind of racism against black people, against Native people.
Right.
And then it gets layered over in time. But as you say, when someone kind of opens it up, opens the door to it, all that history comes flowing out, doesn't it? That kind of dark, ugly history. It
does. And we've been having a lot of conversations. I have a blog where I talk about a lot of the issues that I'm working on, and a lot of the, just global issues that we're facing, both politically, environmentally, and socially. And so a lot of conversations recently have been being had about the idea of privilege. And it brings up a lot of defensiveness in people because they think that it's something that they're claiming and that they're taking advantage of, when really it's not an individual benefit. It's a systematic and structural overlay that people benefit from whether they want it or not. And so to be able to challenge this idea of privilege that excludes entire populations of people from reaching the same type of advancement as others, you have to acknowledge it, and you have to be willing to look at it, and you have to be honest with yourself about how you benefit from it. And I think that's a difficult conversation for people to have, because they automatically assume that they're guilty of something, that there's some kind of blame associated with it. And there really isn't. The only blame that can be associated with it is if you choose to ignore it and to turn your back on it once it's been pointed out to you. And I think that we all have a responsibility from every sector to start addressing those things and having public conversations about them. And as uncomfortable and destructive and violent as this period is, I also see it as being somewhat hopeful, because it's bringing these things into the light that have been hidden in the shadows for so long, which gives us an opportunity to heal them. But we only heal them if we have honest conversations about them.
Can we take a step back? Would you feel comfortable talking a bit about your family, telling us a little bit about your family?
Sure. So my family is Owasus Nagakakus, which is a Bear and Crow clan. My grandmother is Crow clan from Tibayak. She's Passamaquoddy. And my grandfather was Bear clan from Penobscot. And my grandfather founded the Native Studies program at the University of Maine. And he helped to negotiate the waiver program for Native students. When my grandfather was a young man, he had 14 children. And he worked as a construction foreman. He went to school in the evening, and then he worked an overnight shift as a janitor at the university to pay for his education while raising 14 children. And he struggled because there were all kinds of obstacles against him. not only outside of his community, but inside of his community too, because he was only one of 2 students that had ever gone beyond the 8th grade, because people felt that, Indian people only needed rudimentary education, just the ability to have basic writing skills and basic math skills. And so, my grandfather, when he passed away, he was a doctor. And so, there were a lot of challenges for him, which made him a real champion for education for tribal students. And my family's been very involved in the issues that have been facing our tribe for as long as I've been alive, and a lot longer than that as well. And my uncle Wayne was the tribal representative to the legislature for the Penobscot people.
All right. Lately we've, and you referred to this just a little bit, but we've been hearing in the news about the Penobscot River controversy. The state appears to be saying that the Penobscot people have no rights to the river.
Right.
But a long history of treaties with the United States government give the people the right to take care of the river. And I think special emphasis on the words "take care of the river." Could you talk more about this whole area of controversy right now?
Yeah, I think that this case has really been misrepresented in the media. It's been misrepresented by state officials. It's been misrepresented by attorneys who are associated with this case. It's been couched as a water quality case, and people have been told up and down the river that, the tribe is going to come in and they're going to take away your water rights. They're going to tell you what you can and can't do in the river. And really, this doesn't have anything to do with water quality. The case itself is about the preservation of cultural and traditional rights in those waterways. And so the tribes have always had inherent rights to the lands and to the waterways that surround their community. That didn't change when we entered into the Maine Indian Settlement Act, the Land Claims Agreement. So all of the traditional...
When was that?
1980.
Okay.
So all of the traditional rights that we had that had been memorialized in treaties prior to that agreement were transferred into the Maine Indian Settlement Act. There are also canons of law relating to tribal rights that state specifically that whatever is not, conceded is retained. And so if we don't make an exclusive cession of those rights, then those rights are retained. And the tribes have never abrogated their rights in any way to their waterways. And it's always been understood that they had those rights. The tribe also has sustenance and subsistence rights related to those waterways. And so, there is a water quality standard that's attached to that because they can't fish and eat the fish out of those waters or harvest the plants along those waterways or the wildlife that lives in those areas if they aren't healthy, if the ecosystem is not healthy.
So is this what's really driving this, is industrial pollution up and down the river that is affecting the Penobscot's way of life? Is that the bottom line?
Well, the bottom line for the tribe is that we're trying to preserve our traditional way of life, that we are trying to preserve the cultural and traditional fishing rights that we've had since time immemorial. And that's the bottom line. Corollary to that is the fact that in order for us to maintain our way of life, there needs to be a healthy ecosystem surrounding our communities. The tribe has developed water quality standards that take into account all users along those waterways, but also what our obligations are to our people and to future generations to maintain those fisheries, to improve them. And this really goes to rights and responsibilities. And so when we think about rights and responsibilities, you hear people claiming rights all the time, but nobody talks about what their responsibility is connected to those rights. And so as tribal people, we believe that all of the rights that we stand on are derived from our original agreement, which is our agreement with the Creator. And that agreement requires us to live in balanced harmony with the rest of creation. And so when we looked at the condition of the river, years and years ago, one of the things that was apparent to us is that the waterways had been pretty much destroyed. When I was a little girl, I was forbidden to go into that water. And people that swam in that water would get sores on their body. And today, our children are able to swim in that water. And they're able to swim in that water because when we looked at what are our rights here, we also looked at what are our responsibilities. And so the tribe took an active role, a leadership role in cleaning up the Penobscot River. And the quality of that water has been dramatically improved as a result of that. And so, the two kind of go hand in hand, but the legal action in and of itself is really about the preservation of cultural and traditional fishing rights and a way of life, even though there have been people like Matt Manahan, who is one of the attorneys who's representing some interveners in this case. Every group that we've talked to thus far has had the belief that the tribe is trying to control their discharge rates and to control the water quality standards. And that's completely misleading and false, because that's not what this case is about. And it's also kind of absurd to me, because when we think about that, it really comes down to we're fighting about having cleaner water, which benefits everybody along the waterway.
Yeah. Recently, tribal leaders withdrew from participation in the state legislature in Augusta, making a tribal declaration of sovereignty. What was this really about? I don't think people really understood what was driving this.
Right. Well, the tribes have always had sovereignty. They're recognized as sovereign nations under both federal and international law. And so they have a nationhood status anyway. And so the tribes weren't, there have been comments in the news where people have said, I don't think we should give the tribes sovereignty. Well, you don't give anybody sovereignty. Sovereignty is not something that you give to somebody. Sovereignty is something that is taken. It's something that exists inherently. And so the tribes have always been sovereign, independent nations. And so the issue here is with the increasing bullying, the increasing demanding and, I guess, destructive nature of the relationship with the state of Maine. Our governor has been absolutely absurd in his treatment of tribal people. When he wanted tribes to concede some of their rights, they said, well, no, we're not going to concede our rights. These are, things that we've always done here in these waterways. These are our traditional practices, and we're not going to allow you to take those away from us, which is the right of the tribe, because this is how we've always lived in our homelands. And his response to that was to throw a fit, and to withdraw his support from things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which dealt with severe abuses and the removal of tribal children from their home illegally. And for him to withdraw his support for something that's so important and so emotionally meaningful, so mentally healthy and healing, because he disagreed with tribes over fishing rights, to me is absurd. And so the behavior continued to spiral downward from there. There have been a series of opinions issued by the Attorney General that have been claiming that the tribes don't have cultural and traditional fishing rights when they're memorialized in treaties and in the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. They've been acknowledged by the state of Maine throughout the history of the relationship with the tribes in the state of Maine. They've been recognized by the federal government. In fact, the United States has joined on in this river case in support of the tribes. And during discussions with tribal leaders and with the United States government, the Attorney General has hung up the phone on them, saying that they don't have any right to tell Maine what to do. Well, we have this structure of hierarchy within our legal system where the federal government does have the right to tell the state of Maine when they are overstepping their boundaries and when they're outside of the law. And so there has been this kind of rogue attitude from both the governor and the Attorney General in regard to their relationship with the tribes. And it was a systematic stripping of tribal rights that was occurring, and this real patriarchal and paternalistic kind of attitude toward the tribes that didn't honor the relationship that the state was supposed to be having with the tribes.
So does this mean that the representatives of the tribe that were in the legislature have withdrawn and are no longer there? Is that basically what it means?
Yes, and I mean that's really unfortunate. However, the legislators and the representatives that were in the legislature didn't have voting rights. So, you know, they had a voice there, but they didn't have the right to vote on any legislation. And so the tribes have decided that they were going to amend that relationship. They were going to withdraw from the legislature and send their representatives back at a later date as ambassadors of our nations.
What has been the reaction of the leaders of the legislature to this move by the tribes? Have they been supportive? Have they been critical?
Well, of course, there are always going to be those who are critical. But on the day when the tribal representatives were called out of the legislature by tribal leaders, there were so many people that stood up and walked out with them in the legislative body that they didn't have enough for a quorum. It shut down the legislature for the day. And so there has been incredible support for tribal people from within the legislature. And that's really meaningful and that's really important. But it's also really important for that support to come forward in ways that's really meaningful and in ways that matter in regard to how they're voting on some of these tribal issues.
Let's talk about on the national level for a moment. What's the current climate toward Native peoples across the United States and even up into Canada with the First Nations people? What's happening right now? What are the real issues that are driving organizing on in Native communities?
Well, right now we're seeing the greatest attack on Indigenous rights that we've seen in over 100 years. And most of these issues are connected to industry. And so industry is, like I said earlier, really wanting to get their hands on tribal lands. And so you have people across the board that are waging systematic attacks against tribal land and water rights to try to diminish those rights, to give industry greater access to those lands.
There are even calls now on the part of Republicans in Congress to privatize national parks.
Right.
And so really it's just a full onslaught to destroy everything, essentially,
right.
Isn't it?
Yes. And, you know, Felix Cohen, who was the architect of federal Indian law, he's the one that wrote the original book on federal Indian law, correlated all of the laws and treaties. What he said was that the Indian was the canary in the coal mine, and that what happens to the Indians will eventually happen to us all. And I think that that's one of the reasons why our ally base is growing so rapidly, is that people understand that what's been happening to tribal peoples for the last 500 years, for the last 100 years during this industrial rise, is now creeping out into the commons. And the impacts of those toxic activities is creeping out into, you know, the average citizen's community. And they understand what's at stake. You know, our children have been being poisoned now for decades. We have been had toxic waste dumps and all kinds of really destructive and dangerous industry parked on the borders of our communities for decades, and we've been dealing with the consequences of that. And so we have a lot of experience in dealing with these types of things. So people are really coming into an alliance with tribal peoples because they understand that we have something to offer this discussion, and that since this began, we have been speaking on behalf of the earth.
That really is a good lead into my last question that I'd like to spend our last 5 minutes on.
Okay.
Native people believe in the sacredness of all life, on the interconnectedness of all living things. Could you talk about that, especially as how it contrasts with the conventional mainstream view of thinking and looking at nature as a commodity, something to be profited from,
Right.
not something that is really part of our family?
Right. So we have a creation story that tells us that we were born when Gluskop, who was the man who came from nothing, shot an arrow into the ash tree, and we came out of that. What that tells us is that the ash tree is our kin, and that we have the same type of familial relationship to that ash tree as we do to our human family. When I was talking about who I am and where I come from, I can answer that question with one word, Penobscot. You know, because that's the name of the people, the place, and the land. We're all interconnected. There's no distinguishing line between who we all are. And so we understand that. We call that Skijinawita Hausawagan, which is about living in harmony. It's the traditional way of life. It's about living in harmony and balance with all living beings. And I think that, you know, we don't see the earth as a resource. We see the earth as a source of our survival. And so when we're born into this universe, we enter our first ecosystem, which is our mother's womb. And that body of our mother nourishes and sustains us during the period of our gestation. And then when we're born into this world, that umbilical connection is transferred from the birth mother to the earth mother, who nourishes and sustains us for the remainder of our lives. So we see the earth as a source of our survival. We see our relationship with all other living beings as part of our responsibility that we derive our rights from. And if we fail in that responsibility, and if we fail in honoring all other living beings, then we're no longer going to exist here. And we're already starting to see that, the imbalance that's caused by not recognizing our interrelatedness is leading to the destruction of life for many species all over the planet. And, you know, the thing that people always forget is that the earth doesn't need us. We need the earth. That after we disappear, the earth will go into a healing phase and will heal itself, but we'll no longer be here. And so we have to be mindful of that connection at all times, because our survival as a species is really dependent on it.
Anything we haven't discussed that you'd like to add at this point in time?
I just think that it's really important for people to understand that the nature of things as they stand right now in regard to the relationship with tribal people is very confrontational, and it's very polarizing. And we have to really look at the type of relationship that we want to have with one another as human beings going forward, and to use the relationship that the tribal people have with this land, the relationship that other groups have with tribal people, and think about unifying in our causes, because we're all in this together. It doesn't matter where we come from. If we're from the inner city, if we're from a black community, a Native American community, a white suburban community, it doesn't matter. We're all in the same situation in regard to the ecological destruction. And so we've reached a nexus point where, you know, human rights, environmental rights, and our survival as a species on this planet have all collided, and we all need to be aware of that.
Well, Sherri Mitchell, thank you very much for coming
Thank
on
you.
the show.
It's been a pleasure.
I think you're a great spokesperson.
Thank you.
Person for not only the native people that you come from, but also from our Mother Earth that
Thank
we
you
all
so
live
much.
and need.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.